The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning silence, and Eleanor Pierce knew without looking that her youngest daughter had dropped another milk bottle on the kitchen floor. She did not even flinch anymore. Her hands, red and cracked from 32 years of scrubbing, washing, cooking, and mending, continued their work kneading bread dough as her voice called out with practiced patience to check if anyone was hurt. The year was 1878, and Las Cruces, New Mexico, had been her prison and her home for longer than she cared to remember. Eleanor had arrived in this sun-scorched town as a bride of 16, fresh from St. Louis with dreams painted in watercolors and hopes strung like pearls. Her husband Thomas had promised her a ranch, a future children who would grow strong under the wide western sky. He had delivered on 2 of those promises before a rattlesnake took him 5 years ago, leaving her with 4 children, a failing ranch, and debts that multiplied like rabbits in spring. She had been 27 then, already worn thin by the relentless work of frontier life, but widowhood had aged her another decade in those 5 years. Now her hands told the story her face tried to hide. The calluses were so thick she could barely feel the dough beneath her fingers. Cracks ran along her knuckles like dried riverbeds, some fresh and pink, others old and silvered. She kept them wrapped in clean rags when she could afford to, but most days she just worked through the pain, ignoring the way they sometimes bled into whatever she was washing or cooking. Her children needed to eat. The ranch needed tending. The chickens did not care if her hands hurt when she scattered their feed. Her oldest son Samuel was 17 now, trying his best to be the man of the house, but still too young to command the respect needed to keep the ranch hands from leaving for better pay elsewhere. Her daughters Mary and Catherine, 15 and 13, worked alongside her from dawn until dark. The youngest, 8-year-old Thomas Jr., still had some childhood left in him, but not much. Not in a place like this, where survival ground down dreams into dust. The knock on the door came just as Eleanor was sliding the bread into the oven. She wiped her hands on her apron, wincing as the rough fabric caught on a particularly deep crack, and walked to answer it. The morning sun was already brutal, promising another day where the heat would shimmer off the desert floor like water that was never really there. The man standing on her porch was a stranger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of winter sky. He held his hat in his hands, his dark hair slightly disheveled from where it had been pressed down. He looked to be in his early 30s, maybe a year or 2 older than Eleanor, though the life in his face suggested he had seen more than his share of hard times. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. "Name's Fletcher Sutton. I'm looking for work. Heard in town you might need a ranch hand." Eleanor's first instinct was to say no. She could barely afford to feed her own children, let alone pay a stranger a fair wage. But something in the way he stood there, patient and respectful, made her hesitate. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well-maintained. This was a man who took care of what he had, even when what he had was not much. "I cannot pay much," she said honestly. $2 a week and meals. The work is hard and the ranch is not what it used to be." "That will do fine, madam," Fletcher said. "I am not afraid of hard work." She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Barn is out back. You can sleep in the loft. There is a water pump by the corral. Breakfast is at dawn, lunch at noon, supper at sunset. We do not waste food and we do not tolerate drinking or fighting." "Understood, madam." He settled his hat back on his head and started to turn away, then paused. "Might I ask your name?" "Eleanor Pierce. This is the Pierce Ranch, though it is more memory than reality these days." Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been understanding or sympathy, but he just nodded and walked toward the barn. Eleanor watched him go, noting the slight limp in his left leg, the way he carried himself like a man who had learned to move quietly through the world. She wondered what brought a man like that to her door looking for work that paid barely enough to survive. But then again, this was the frontier. Everyone had a story, and most of them were written in scars. The days fell into a new rhythm after Fletcher's arrival. He was up before dawn, working on repairs to the corral that Samuel had been meaning to get to for months. He fixed the lean in the barn door, replaced rotted boards in the porch, and somehow coaxed the old windmill back to life so that water flowed more freely to the troughs. He worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of experience, never complaining, rarely speaking unless spoken to first. Eleanor found herself watching him sometimes when she thought he would not notice. The way he handled the horses with gentle firmness, speaking to them in low tones that seemed to calm even the most skittish mare. The way he showed Samuel how to properly mend a fence line, patient and thorough in his explanations. The way he smiled at little Thomas Jr. when the boy followed him around asking endless questions about everything from how to tie a proper knot to whether Fletcher had ever seen a real Indian war party. It was nearly 2 weeks before they had a real conversation beyond discussing chores and meals. Eleanor was out by the well, hauling up bucket after bucket of water to fill the large tubs for washing. It was laundry day, which meant her hands would be raw and bleeding by evening, soaked in lye soap and twisted around wet cloth until every crack screamed in protest. She had wrapped them in strips of old sheeting that morning, but the fabric was already stained pink in places. Fletcher appeared beside her as she was struggling with a particularly heavy bucket, the rope burning through her wrapped palms. Without a word, he took the rope from her hands and hauled the bucket up himself, then another and another, until all 4 wash tubs were full. "You did not need to do that," Eleanor said, her pride stinging even as relief flooded through her tired arms. "I have been managing fine." "I know you have," Fletcher said quietly, "but managing and doing well are not always the same thing." She wanted to argue, to assert that she was perfectly capable, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she found herself looking down at her wrapped hands, at the way the makeshift bandages were already coming loose, already failing to protect skin that had no protection left to give. "How long have they been like that?" Fletcher asked, gesturing to her hands. "Long enough," Eleanor said shortly. Then, because something in his expression was kind rather than pitying, she added, "Years, since before my husband died. It is just what happens when you work." "It is what happens when you work too hard without help," Fletcher corrected gently. "Without rest." "Rest is a luxury I cannot afford." "Maybe not," he acknowledged, "but there are ways to make the work easier, ways to heal what has been hurt." Before she could respond, he walked away back toward the barn. Eleanor stood there by the well, confused and oddly touched by the exchange. No one had noticed her hands before, not really. Her children saw them every day and probably thought they had always looked like this. The few neighbors who still visited were too caught up in their own struggles to pay attention to something as small as one woman's cracked and bleeding hands. That evening, after supper had been cleared and the children had scattered to their evening chores, Fletcher knocked on the kitchen door. He held a small tin in his calloused hands. "My mother used to make this," he said, setting it on the table. "Beeswax, lanolin, and herbs." She was a washerwoman in San Antonio before she died. Her hands looked a lot like yours. Eleanor stared at the tin as if it might bite her. "I cannot accept this." "It is not charity," Fletcher said, "just one worker looking out for another. You cannot run a ranch with hands that are too damaged to hold a rope or a hammer." He was right, of course. She knew he was right. But accepting help had become so foreign to her after years of standing alone that she almost did not know how. Still, the pain in her hands was a constant companion, and the promise of relief was too tempting to refuse entirely. "Thank you," she said finally, the words stiff but genuine. Fletcher nodded and turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Mrs. Pierce, you have done an incredible thing, keeping this ranch going alone. Anyone with eyes can see that, but you do not have to be alone anymore." He was gone before she could formulate a response, leaving her standing in her kitchen with a tin of salve and a heart that suddenly felt too full for her chest. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat by lamplight and unwrapped her hands. The sight made her wince even after all these years. The skin was mottled red and white, the cracks so deep in some places she could see the pink flesh beneath. She opened the tin Fletcher had given her, and was immediately enveloped in a scent that was both medicinal and soothing. Herbs she could not name mixed with the waxy sweetness of honey and beeswax. She scooped out a small amount and rubbed it gently over her right hand. The salve was cool and thick, and as she worked it into the damaged skin, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not quite relief, not yet, but the promise of it. The possibility that things could be better than they were. She did both hands, taking her time, letting herself have this one small moment of care. Then she wrapped them in clean cloth and sat for a while in the quiet kitchen, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about the stranger in her barn who had noticed her pain when no one else had. The weeks turned into a month, and Fletcher became a permanent fixture on the ranch. He never spoke much about his past, though little details emerged in fragments. He had been a soldier once, cavalry, which explained the ease with which he handled horses. He had drifted after leaving the army, working ranches from Texas to Colorado, never staying long in one place. When Samuel asked him why he did not have his own land, Fletcher just said that some men were not meant to put down roots, though there was a sadness in his voice that suggested maybe that was not entirely by choice. Eleanor found herself looking forward to the meals they shared, to the quiet conversations that happened in the spaces between work. Fletcher had opinions about everything from the best way to train a cutting horse to whether New Mexico would ever become a proper state. He listened when she talked about the struggles of keeping the ranch afloat, offering suggestions without ever making her feel incapable. He made her daughter Mary laugh with silly stories, and he taught Catherine how to whittle, and he showed young Thomas how to skip stones at the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Most importantly, he noticed things. He noticed when Eleanor was too tired to eat her own supper, setting aside a plate for later when she would have the energy. He noticed when the workload was too much, finding ways to shoulder extra burdens without making it obvious. He noticed her hands. Every few days he would appear with that tin of salve, sometimes freshly made, and set it where she would find it. He never made a show of it, never drew attention to what he was doing. It was just there, a quiet act of care that spoke louder than words ever could. Eleanor's hands began to heal. Slowly at first, so gradually she almost did not notice. But then one morning she woke up and realized the constant pain had dulled to a manageable ache. The deepest cracks were closing, new skin forming pink and tender beneath the old damage. She found she could grip things without wincing, could plunge her hands into wash water without the immediate sharp sting that had become so familiar. It was a July evening, the heat still radiating off the desert floor even as the sun dipped below the horizon, when everything shifted between them. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden, trying to save what she could of the struggling vegetables. The well water helped, but there had been no rain in weeks, and the plants were suffering. Her hands were in the dirt, coaxing life from dry soil when Fletcher approached. "I fixed that broken spoke on the wagon wheel," he said, crouching down beside her. "Should hold now for a good long while. Thank you." Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along when you did." "You would have managed," Fletcher said. "You have been managing for years." "Managing is not the same as living," Eleanor said, echoing his words from weeks ago. Something changed in Fletcher's expression, a softness entering those winter sky eyes. "No," he agreed quietly, "it is not." They stayed there in the garden as twilight deepened, talking about small things and large ones. Fletcher told her about growing up in a small Texas town, about losing his parents to fever when he was 19, about joining the cavalry because he had nowhere else to go. He told her about the things he had seen during the Indian campaigns, his voice growing quiet and pained, and Eleanor understood that this was a man who carried regrets heavy as stones. In turn, she told him about St. Louis, about the girl she had been who thought love and adventure were the same thing. About Thomas, who had been kind but distant, more married to his dreams of building an empire than to the young woman who shared his bed. About the loneliness of being surrounded by children but having no one to talk to, no one to share the burden of decisions and fears and hopes. "You ever think about leaving?" Fletcher asked. "Selling the ranch, taking the children somewhere easier?" "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "But this land is all I have to give them, all that is left of their father's dreams. I cannot just abandon it, even when it feels like it is killing me." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. Not the cautious, polite touch of an acquaintance, but the firm, warm grip of someone who truly saw her. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, tracing the healing cracks that still marked her skin. "Your hands were cracked from a lifetime of work," he said softly, "but they are healing now. Maybe that means other things can heal too." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his calluses matched hers, two people marked by hard work and harder times. "What are you saying, Fletcher?" He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw hope and fear, and something that might have been love. If love could grow in the space of a few weeks between two people who had both learned to expect nothing from life but hardship. "I am saying that I came here looking for work, but I found something I did not expect. I am saying that I would like to stay, not just as a hired hand, but as something more, if you would have me." The weight of that offer settled over Eleanor like a warm blanket on a cold night. She thought of all the reasons she should say no. She barely knew this man. He could be anyone, hiding any kind of past. She had 4 children to think of, a ranch to run, no room in her life for romance or foolishness. But then she looked at their hands again, at the evidence of care he had shown without asking for anything in return, and she realized that sometimes knowing someone's actions was more important than knowing their entire history. "I do not need a hero," she said carefully. "I do not need someone to rescue me or fix all my problems. I have been standing on my own for too long to lean on someone else now." "I know," Fletcher said. "I am not offering to save you, Eleanor. I am offering to stand beside you. There is a difference." The use of her first name, spoken in that low Texas drawl, sent warmth spreading through her chest. "The children," she said. "They would have to accept you. They already do, I think, but I would work to earn their trust properly, however long it took." Eleanor looked toward the house, where lamplight glowed in the windows and she could hear the faint sound of her daughters laughing about something. She thought about the years ahead, the endless work and worry and weariness. And then she thought about facing those years not alone, but with someone who saw her, truly saw her, and chose to stay anyway. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I would have you. Fletcher's face broke into a smile that transformed him, erasing years of hard living and revealing the younger man he must have been before life wore him down. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, reverently, as if they were precious rather than ruined. We will do this properly, he said. I will court you the right way, take you to town, let people see us together. Speak to Samuel, make sure he understands my intentions are honorable, and when enough time has passed that everyone knows this is real and right, I will marry you. If you will have me. I will have you, Eleanor repeated, and this time the words felt like a vow. The courting period that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced, even in the early days with Thomas. Fletcher treated her with a gentleness she had not known she was missing, a respect that made her feel valued rather than necessary. He brought her wildflowers from the desert, hardy blooms that survived against all odds. He convinced her to take Sunday afternoons off from work, and they would ride out to the creek with a simple picnic, talking about everything and nothing while the children played in the water. The town of Las Cruces watched with interest and, Eleanor suspected, some judgment. A widow was supposed to mourn longer than 5 years before taking up with another man. Never mind that those 5 years had been spent working herself into an early grave. There were whispers at the general store, sidelong looks at church. But Fletcher never seemed bothered by it, and gradually Eleanor found she was not either. Let them talk. She had earned the right to choose happiness where she found it. Samuel took the news better than she had expected. He sat down with Fletcher one evening, man to man, and they talked for over an hour. When Samuel emerged from the barn where they had been talking, he found Eleanor on the porch and hugged her tight. "He is a good man, Mama," Samuel said. "He told me he would not try to replace Papa, but that he would do his best to help us all. That is all we can ask." The girls were thrilled. Mary, ever the romantic at 15, declared it the most wonderful thing that had ever happened, and immediately began planning a wedding in her head. Catherine was more reserved but clearly pleased, especially when Fletcher continued to make time for whittling lessons and quiet conversations. Young Thomas simply accepted Fletcher as part of the family now, which in a child's way was perhaps the highest compliment of all. As summer deepened into the scorching heat of August, Eleanor found herself transforming. The constant tension she had carried for years began to ease from her shoulders. Her hands continued to heal, the cracks fading to thin white lines that only hurt in the coldest weather. She started sleeping better, eating better, even laughing more. Fletcher drew out a side of her she had thought was dead and buried, a capacity for joy and hope that had been crushed under the weight of survival. They were married in September of 1878, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Las Cruces. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue cotton that Mary and Catherine had helped her sew, and Fletcher wore a new suit that probably cost him every penny of his saved wages. Samuel stood up with Fletcher and Mary with her mother, and the preacher spoke about love and commitment and the blessing of second chances. When Fletcher kissed her at the altar, Eleanor felt something shift deep in her soul. This was not the desperate union of her youth, built on dreams and ignorance. This was a choice made by two people who knew exactly how hard life could be, and decided to face it together anyway. The ranch began to flourish under Fletcher's steady hand and Samuel's growing confidence. With 2 men working the land, and Eleanor freed up to focus on the house and garden, things that had been falling apart for years finally got properly fixed. They acquired a few more head of cattle, bred the horses successfully, and even managed to put some money aside for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember. More than that, the ranch became a home again rather than just a place where they struggled to survive. There was laughter at the dinner table, conversations that went beyond just coordinating work schedules. Fletcher taught Samuel to play the harmonica, and in the evenings they would sometimes have impromptu concerts on the porch while the sun set over the desert. Mary started writing poetry, which she would shyly share with Eleanor and Fletcher. Catherine discovered a talent for training horses, working with the foals with a patience and intuition that impressed even Fletcher. Young Thomas grew like a weed, all energy and questions and joy. And Eleanor, for the first time since leaving St. Louis all those years ago, felt like she could breathe. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. They had to learn each other's rhythms, navigate the complexities of blending a family, figure out how to be partners in both work and life. There were disagreements about how to handle the children, about money, about which repairs were most urgent. But they talked through everything, neither one willing to let resentment build the way Eleanor knew it had in her first marriage. Fletcher proved to be a patient and generous husband in all ways. He was affectionate without being overbearing, passionate without being demanding. He made Eleanor feel desired for the first time in her life, not just as a body to be used, but as a woman worthy of tenderness and attention. The physical intimacy between them was a revelation, something she had not expected at her age, having assumed that such things were for young people who did not know better. In the spring of 1879, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news struck her with a complex mixture of emotions. She was 33 years old, had already raised 4 children, had assumed that part of her life was finished. The pregnancy would be hard on her body, would add another mouth to feed, would complicate everything. But when she told Fletcher, the look of pure joy on his face made all her worries feel small. "A child of our own," he said, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that always surprised her given his size and strength. "Eleanor, you have given me more than I ever dreamed of having." "You are not worried?" she asked. "About the cost, the work, all of it, we will manage," Fletcher said, using her own old refrain with a smile. "And this time you will not be managing alone." He kept that promise. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed and the work became harder, Fletcher took on more and more of her duties without complaint. He hired another ranch hand, a young man named Diego who was grateful for the work and proved to be as reliable as Fletcher himself. Samuel stepped up even more, taking on responsibilities that would have crushed him a year ago, but that he now handled with growing confidence. The girls rallied around their mother, excited about a new baby, handling more of the household work so Eleanor could rest. It was still a foreign concept, but Eleanor was learning to sit down when she was tired, learning to accept help without feeling like she was failing, learning that strength was not the same as doing everything alone. The baby came in December, a cold night when the desert wind howled around the house and the stars seemed close enough to touch. It was a difficult birth, harder than any of her previous ones, and there were moments when Eleanor wondered if she would survive it. But Fletcher never left her side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love, being her anchor in the storm of pain. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced and perfect, the midwife placed him in Eleanor's arms and she wept. Not from pain or fear or even relief, but from the overwhelming rush of love that filled her. A son, born of love rather than duty, born into a family that was whole and happy and secure. They named him James after Fletcher's father, and from the moment he entered the world he was adored. Samuel was amazed at how tiny his new brother was, holding him with such careful reverence. Mary and Catherine doted on him constantly, fighting over who got to help with feedings and changings. Young Thomas, now 9, took his role as big brother very seriously, announcing to everyone who would listen that he was going to teach James everything he needed to know about being a man. But it was Fletcher who surprised Eleanor most. She had seen him be gentle with the children, patient with animals, kind in all his dealings. But watching him with his son was something else entirely. He would spend hours just holding James, studying his tiny features with wonder, talking to him in that low, soothing voice about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they would do together when James was older. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor at night when James was fussy, and looked at Eleanor with such gratitude in his eyes that it made her heart ache. "You gave me a family," he said one night when James was a few weeks old. They were lying in bed, the baby asleep in a cradle nearby, and Fletcher had his arm around Eleanor, holding her close. "I never thought I would have this. I thought I would just drift forever, working other people's land, sleeping in other people's barns, never belonging anywhere." "You belong here," Eleanor said firmly. "With us. You are home, Fletcher." He kissed the top of her head, and she felt moisture that might have been tears. "I know," he whispered. "I am finally home." The years that followed were marked by a peace and prosperity that Eleanor had never imagined possible. The ranch continued to grow, building a solid reputation for quality horses and cattle. Samuel, at 21, married a girl from town named Rosa, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the property. Mary followed 2 years later, wedding a schoolteacher who had moved to Las Cruces from back east. Catherine stayed on the ranch, having no interest in marriage but every interest in the horses, eventually becoming known throughout the territory as one of the best horse trainers around. Young Thomas, who everyone now just called Tom to avoid confusion with his late father, showed an aptitude for business that surprised them all. He started keeping proper books for the ranch, finding ways to maximize profit without sacrificing quality, making deals with buyers that earned them better prices. By the time he was 18, he was essentially running the business side of things while Fletcher and Samuel handled the physical labor. James grew from a placid baby into an energetic toddler, and then a bright, curious child. He had his father's eyes and his mother's determination, a combination that meant he was constantly getting into everything. But he was also sweet-natured and affectionate, quick to hug and even quicker to forgive. Watching him grow, seeing Fletcher teach him to ride and rope and all the skills of ranch life, filled Eleanor with a contentment she had not known was possible. By the time James was 5, in 1884, the Pierce Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the area. They had expanded their land holdings, hired a small crew of permanent workers, and built a new house with proper rooms for everyone, and even a bathtub that did not have to be filled by hand. Eleanor's days were still full of work, but it was work of her choosing now, done at a pace she could maintain, supported by people who cared about her. Most importantly, her hands had healed. Oh, the scars remained, thin white lines that would never fully disappear. But the pain was gone, replaced by the simple calluses of honest work done without desperation behind it. When she looked at her hands now, she did not see ruin. She saw survival. She saw strength. She saw the evidence of a life lived fully, even when that life was hard. One evening in late spring, as the desert bloomed with unexpected color after a rare rainy winter, Eleanor and Fletcher sat on the porch of their new house. James was asleep inside, worn out from a day of following his father around and trying to help with everything. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, and the air had that perfect temperature that happened only a few times a year, warm enough to be comfortable but cool enough to be refreshing. Fletcher reached over and took Eleanor's hand, as he had done countless times over the years. His thumb traced over her knuckles, following the faint lines that were all that remained of the damage. "You remember the first time I held your hands?" he asked quietly. "I remember," Eleanor said. "I thought you were foolish, wasting good salve on something that could not be fixed." "But I was right," Fletcher said with a smile. "They could be fixed. They just needed time and care." "Like me," Eleanor said. "I needed time and care too. I did not even realize how broken I was until you showed me what healing could look like." Fletcher brought her hand to his lips, kissing each knuckle gently. "You were never broken," he said. "Bent, maybe, worn down by circumstances, but never broken. You were always strong, Eleanor. You just needed someone to see that strength and tell you it was okay to rest sometimes." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "Rest," she repeated, the word that had changed everything. "You told me to rest, and I thought you did not understand, but you understood better than I did." "I understood that strength without rest eventually becomes brittle," Fletcher said. "That work without joy is just another kind of prison. That survival is not the same as living." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished its descent, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Tom practicing his sums aloud, still dedicated to his studies even at 14. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and the horses in the corral whinnied softly in response. This was life now. Not perfect, never perfect, because life was messy and complicated and full of challenges. But it was good, it was real, it was everything Eleanor had stopped believing she could have. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible. For caring when no one else did. For holding my broken hands and believing they could heal." Fletcher tightened his arm around her shoulders. "You do not have to thank me for loving you, Eleanor. It has been the easiest thing I have ever done." Over the years that followed, Eleanor and Fletcher built more than just a successful ranch. They built a legacy. Samuel and Rosa had 3 children who grew up riding horses before they could walk properly. Mary and her husband James, the schoolteacher, had 2 daughters who inherited their father's love of learning and their mother's romantic soul. Catherine never did marry, but she built a barn of her own on the ranch property and started a successful horse breeding program that brought buyers from as far away as California. Tom married at 22 to a sharp-minded woman named Elena who was half Mexican and half Irish and took no nonsense from anyone. They had 4 children in quick succession, all of them as business-savvy as their father and as fierce as their mother. Tom eventually expanded the ranch operations to include freight hauling, leveraging their location along the trade routes to build a profitable side business. James grew into a young man who had his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He was patient with animals and people alike, had a gift for reading the land that made him an excellent rancher, and possessed a gentle kindness that reminded Eleanor of Fletcher when he had first arrived at their door. When he was 18, he began courting a girl named Sarah from town, and Eleanor saw in their interactions the same careful respect and genuine affection that had marked her relationship with Fletcher. By the time 1895 rolled around, Eleanor was 50 years old and Fletcher was 53. They had been married for 17 years, together for 18. The ranch was thriving, their children and grandchildren were happy and healthy, and Las Cruces had grown from a dusty frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches, and even a small hospital. Eleanor's hands bore the marks of a life of hard work, but they no longer hurt. The scars were just part of her now, no more troubling than the silver in her hair or the lines around her eyes. She had learned to be proud of those scars, to see them as evidence of survival rather than damage. On their 17th wedding anniversary, Fletcher surprised her with a trip to St. Louis. It had been 34 years since she had left as a starry-eyed bride, and she had never expected to return. But Tom and Catherine promised they could handle the ranch for a few weeks, and Fletcher had been saving up for this, wanting to show Eleanor that life could include more than just work, even now. The train ride east was an adventure in itself. Eleanor had never been on a train before, and the speed and comfort of it amazed her. They had a small private compartment, and they spent the days watching the landscape change from desert to plains to the green hills of the Mississippi Valley, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the rare luxury of having nothing to do but be together. St. Louis was both familiar and foreign. The bones of the city Eleanor remembered were still there, but it had grown enormously, modern and bustling and electric. Literally electric, she discovered, as many buildings now had electric lights that seemed like magic compared to the oil lamps she was accustomed to. They stayed in a nice hotel, nothing too fancy but comfortable, and spent their days exploring. Eleanor showed Fletcher the neighborhood where she had grown up, though many of the buildings had changed. They visited the Mississippi River, much wider and more imposing than the modest creek that ran through their ranch. They went to the theater, saw a production of Romeo and Juliet that made Eleanor cry and Fletcher squeeze her hand in the darkness. But the most important moment of the trip came on their last evening in the city. They were walking along the riverfront, watching boats move up and down the water when Fletcher stopped and turned to face her. "I have something I want to tell you," he said. "Something I should have said years ago but did not have the words for." Eleanor felt a flutter of nerves, though she could not have said why. "What is it?" Fletcher took both of her hands in his, looking down at them, at the scars and calluses and the simple gold band she wore. "When I came to your ranch that day, I was running," he said quietly. "Running from my past, from my mistakes, from everything I had done that I could not take back. I had given up on the idea of being happy. I was just trying to survive, one job to the next, one day to the next." He looked up, meeting her eyes, and she saw the depth of emotion there. "But then I saw you. This woman who was working herself to death but refused to give up. This woman who was so strong and so tired and so beautiful even though she did not know it. And I thought, if she can keep fighting when life has beaten her down so hard, maybe I can too." "Fletcher," Eleanor whispered, not sure what to say. "You saved me," he continued. "Not the other way around. People in town probably think I rescued you, the widow who needed a man to set things right. But the truth is, you gave me a reason to stop running. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me love when I did not think I deserved it." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now. "You did the same for me," she said. "You saw me when I was invisible. You cared when I thought no one ever would again." "We saved each other," Fletcher said softly. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing them with the same gentle reverence he had shown that day in the garden so many years ago. "Your hands were cracked from a lifetime of work, and I told you to rest. But what I really meant was, rest with me. Heal with me, live with me, not just survive." "And I have," Eleanor said. "Oh, Fletcher, I have." They kissed there by the river, two people in the middle of their lives who had learned that it was never too late for happiness, never too late to heal, never too late to love. When they returned to Las Cruces, they found the ranch running smoothly and their family eager to hear about their adventures. Eleanor told stories about St. Louis while she kneaded bread dough, her hands strong and sure in the familiar rhythm. Fletcher demonstrated the new rope technique he had learned from a fellow traveler on the train. James showed them the new colt that had been born while they were gone, a beautiful bay with his mother's gentle eyes. Life continued in its steady rhythm, seasons passing, children growing, the work of the ranch requiring attention but no longer consuming them entirely. Eleanor found time to pursue small interests she had abandoned long ago. She started keeping a journal, writing down memories and thoughts and observations about the changing world. She joined a women's group in town that discussed books and current events, relishing the intellectual stimulation she had not had since leaving St. Louis. Fletcher took up woodworking in the winter months when ranch work slowed down, creating beautiful furniture pieces that gradually filled their home. He made a rocking chair for Eleanor that was perfectly balanced, a desk for Tom's office, a hope chest for each of their granddaughters. His hands, like Eleanor's, bore the marks of hard work, but they also created beauty. In 1900, as a new century dawned, Eleanor and Fletcher celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family. The ranch house was full to bursting with children and grandchildren, laughter echoing off the walls, the smell of Eleanor's cooking filling every room. Samuel was 39 now, his oldest child nearly grown. Mary was 37, Catherine 35, Tom 31. James, their youngest, was a man of 21 with a new wife, and plans to build a house on the southern portion of the ranch property. As Eleanor looked around at the family she and Fletcher had built together, adding his love to the foundation she had laid alone for so many years, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what rest had brought her, not the absence of work, but the presence of joy. Not the end of struggle, but the knowledge that she did not struggle alone. That evening, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Eleanor and Fletcher sat once more on their porch. It had become their ritual over the years, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Fletcher's hair was more silver than dark now, and Eleanor's face bore the lines of a life fully lived. But when he took her hand, his touch was as gentle and reverent as it had been 22 years ago. "Your hands are beautiful," he said, tracing the scars that had faded to barely visible lines. Eleanor laughed softly. "They are the hands of an old woman who has worked too hard." "They are the hands of a warrior," Fletcher corrected, "of a survivor, of a woman who refused to break no matter how much pressure was put on her. Of a mother and wife and rancher who built something lasting and real." He kissed her knuckles, each one, with the patient tenderness that was so essentially him. "They are the hands I fell in love with, cracks and all, the hands that welcomed me home when I was lost. The hands that have held me and our children and built this life we share." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, still moved by his words after all these years. "You told me to rest," she said, "and I did. But I never could have rested if you had not been there to stand beside me, to share the weight, to remind me that I was not alone." "You will never be alone again," Fletcher promised. "Not as long as I have breath in my body." They sat together as the stars emerged, one by one, in the vast desert sky. The night was cool and quiet, the ranch sleeping around them, tomorrow's work waiting but not weighing. This was what happiness looked like, Eleanor thought. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of love strong enough to bear whatever came. Her hands, scarred and healed, rested in Fletcher's, 2 lives intertwined, 2 hearts beating steady and sure. They had found each other when both were lost, had built a home from the ashes of old dreams, had created a family that would outlast them both. And when the work of life grew hard, as it always did, they had each other to lean on. They had learned to rest together, in the shelter of a love that had transformed 2 broken people into something whole. The years continued to pass with the steady inevitability of seasons turning. Fletcher and Eleanor grew older, their bodies slowing even as their love remained constant. They watched their children become elders themselves, watch their grandchildren marry and have children of their own. The Pierce Ranch became a landmark in the region, known not just for quality livestock, but for being a family operation that spanned generations. In 1910, when Eleanor was 65 and Fletcher was 68, they decided it was time to step back from the daily operations of the ranch. James had been essentially running things for several years anyway, with help from Tom's eldest son Benjamin. It was a good time to let the younger generation take full control, to enjoy the fruits of decades of labor without the constant pressure of responsibility. This did not mean Eleanor stopped working entirely. That would have been impossible for her, so ingrained was the habit of productivity. But she worked now at her own pace, tending her kitchen garden and preserving food and baking bread not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She spent long afternoons with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days, about how the ranch had nearly failed, about how a drifting cowboy had appeared one morning and changed everything. Fletcher built a workshop behind the house and devoted himself more fully to woodworking. His pieces became sought after throughout the territory, beautiful and functional items that bore the marks of his care and skill. He made a cradle for each new great-grandchild, rocking chairs for every daughter and daughter-in-law, a magnificent dining table that sat 20 people and became the centerpiece of family gatherings. They traveled sometimes, short trips to Albuquerque or Santa Fe, once even to California to see the ocean. Eleanor had never seen anything like the Pacific, that vast expanse of water reaching to the horizon, and she stood on the beach with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty and bigness of the world. Fletcher held her hand and said nothing, understanding that some moments required no words, but they always came home to Las Cruces, to the ranch that had been the making of them both. The desert was in their blood now, that harsh, beautiful landscape that had tested them and forged them and ultimately blessed them. They could not imagine living anywhere else. In the spring of 1915, Fletcher fell ill. It started as a cough, nothing serious at first, but it lingered and worsened despite all of Eleanor's remedies. By summer, he was struggling to breathe, his once strong body weakening before her eyes. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia, complicated by years of breathing dust and working in all weathers. He prescribed rest and warmth and hope, but they all knew that sometimes those things were not enough. Eleanor refused to leave his side. She set up a cot in their bedroom so she could be near him day and night, monitoring his breathing, bringing him water and broth, holding his hand through the worst of the fever. Their children came and went, helping where they could, but this was her vigil to keep. After 40 years together, 37 of them as husband and wife, she would not leave him to fight alone. Fletcher was aware enough to know what was happening. On a clear August morning, when the fever had broken temporarily and he could think and speak clearly, he pulled Eleanor close. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I have had a good life, better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do not talk like that," Eleanor said fiercely. "You are going to recover. You are strong, Fletcher. You have always been strong." "I am tired," he said gently. "So tired, Eleanor, and I think it is my turn to rest now." "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, I am not ready. I will never be ready." Fletcher reached up and cupped her face with one shaking hand. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said. "You survived before I came, and you will survive after I am gone. You do not need me to keep standing." "But I want you," Eleanor sobbed. "I want you here with me. I want more time. We were supposed to have more time." "We had 37 years," Fletcher said. 37 blessed years when I expected to have none. That is more than enough for any man. He pulled her down until she was lying beside him, held her as close as his weakened arms could manage. "Remember what I told you that day in the garden. Your hands were cracked from a lifetime of work, and I told you to rest. But you gave me rest too, Eleanor. You gave me a home when I was wandering. You gave me peace when I was troubled. You gave me love when I thought I was unworthy of it." "You were always worthy," Eleanor whispered against his chest. "Always. Because you saw worth in me," Fletcher said. "You saw past the drifter with nothing to his name and saw the man I could be. You made me better than I was." They lay together in the quiet morning, holding each other, saying all the things that needed to be said and many that did not need words at all. Fletcher slept for a while, his breathing labored but steady, and Eleanor prayed harder than she had ever prayed for anything that he would wake again. He did wake once more that evening as the sun was setting. The whole family had gathered, sensing the end was near. Samuel and Rosa, Mary and her husband, Catherine, Tom and Elena, James and Sarah, all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren crowded into the house. They each said their goodbyes, thanking Fletcher for being a father and grandfather, for building the legacy they all enjoyed, for showing them what love and commitment looked like. But when everyone else had left the room, when it was just Eleanor and Fletcher again in the dimming light, he took her hand one final time. His grip was weak, barely there, but she held on with all the strength she had. "I love you," he said, the words little more than breath. "Every day I loved you." "I love you too," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Rest now, my love, you have earned it, rest." Fletcher smiled, his eyes closing peacefully. "Rest," he echoed, and then he was gone. The grief was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced, even when she lost her first husband. Thomas's death had been a shock and a burden, but Fletcher's death was the loss of half her soul. She moved through the days that followed in a fog of pain, accepting condolences numbly, allowing her children to handle the funeral arrangements because she could not bear to make those decisions. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that bore his name and the dates of his life and the inscription Eleanor had chosen. "Beloved husband and father." He taught us to rest. For weeks after, Eleanor could barely function. She went through the motions of living, eating when food was put in front of her, sleeping when exhaustion overtook her, but feeling nothing except the gaping absence where Fletcher should have been. Her children worried, hovering around her, trying to help but not knowing how to ease this kind of pain. It was Catherine who finally broke through. She came to sit with her mother one afternoon, taking Eleanor's hands in hers and just holding them silently. "After a long time," she said, "Papa would not want you to stop living. He would want you to keep going, Mama, to keep being strong." "I do not feel strong," Eleanor said, the first words she had spoken in days that were not automatic responses. "But you are," Catherine insisted. "You were strong before Papa came, and you are still strong now. He did not make you strong. He just helped you see what was already there." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, at her daughter's fingers wrapped around hers. She thought about all the times Fletcher had held these hands, the gentle way he had cared for them when they were damaged, the reverence with which he always treated them. And she realized that the greatest gift he had given her was not fixing her hands or even fixing her life. It was teaching her that she deserved care, that she deserved rest, that she deserved love. That lesson did not die with him. Slowly, painfully, Eleanor began to live again. Not the same as before, because how could she be the same without him? But she remembered what he had taught her about rest, about joy, about making space for life beyond just work. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them to cook and garden and preserve food. She wrote more in her journal, recording memories of Fletcher while they were still fresh, wanting future generations to know what kind of man he had been. She visited his grave every Sunday, bringing wildflowers from the desert, the hardy blooms that survived against all odds. She would sit beside the headstone and talk to him, telling him about the ranch and the children and all the small details he would have cared about. It helped. These one-sided conversations made her feel like he was not entirely gone. The years passed. Eleanor continued aging, her body growing more frail even as her spirit remained unbroken. She lived to see James's children grow up and marry, lived to meet great-great-grandchildren who bore the names of their ancestors. The Pierce Ranch continued to prosper, now entering its fourth generation of family ownership, a testament to the foundation Eleanor and Fletcher had built together. On a warm September day in 1925, Eleanor Pierce died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. She had lived 10 years beyond Fletcher, 10 years that she had filled with as much love and purpose as she could manage. Her children found her in the morning, lying in the bed she had shared with Fletcher, a small smile on her face as if she had seen something pleasant in her dreams. They buried her next to Fletcher on the hill, their headstones side by side, reunited in death as they had been in life. At the funeral, which was attended by what seemed like half of Las Cruces, James stood up to speak about his mother. "My mama was the strongest person I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She survived things that would have broken other people. She worked herself nearly to death to keep our family together and this ranch running. But what I remember most about her was not the work. It was the love." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, family and friends spanning generations. "My papa used to say that Mama's hands were cracked from a lifetime of work, and that he told her to rest. But what he really gave her, what they gave each other, was permission to live. To find joy even in hardship. To love fully even when love seemed impossible. That is the legacy they left us. Not just this ranch, but the knowledge that we are worthy of rest and love and happiness." There was not a dry eye in the gathering as they lowered Eleanor into the ground, returning her to the desert soil that had been her home for 59 years. But there was also a sense of celebration, of a life well lived, of a love that had transformed two wounded people into something beautiful. The ranch continued for generations after, always in the Pierce family, always remembering its roots. In the main house, now updated with modern conveniences but still bearing the bones of the original structure, there was a room dedicated to Eleanor and Fletcher. Their photographs hung on the wall, young and vibrant in their wedding portrait, older and more weathered in later pictures. Fletcher's handmade furniture filled the space. Eleanor's journals were preserved in a glass case, available for family members to read and remember. And on a small table by the window sat a tin, old and battered but carefully maintained. It was the salve tin that Fletcher had first given Eleanor all those years ago, the beginning of everything. Inside, pressed between layers of wax paper, were dried wildflowers from the desert, the kind that bloomed against all odds, the kind that Eleanor had brought to Fletcher's grave every Sunday, the kind that now grew wild on the hill where they both rested. The tin bore a small engraved plaque, added by James many years ago with a simple inscription. Her hands were cracked from a lifetime of work. He told her to rest, and in that rest they found everything. It was a love story written in scars and healing, in hard work and gentle care, in the harsh beauty of the desert and the enduring strength of two people who chose each other when they both needed choosing most. It was the story of Eleanor and Fletcher, the woman who thought she had to be strong alone, and the man who showed her that strength could be shared. And long after they were gone, their story lived on in the ranch they had saved, in the family they had built, In the lesson they had taught about the courage to rest and the grace of letting yourself be loved. The desert wind blew across the hill where they rested together, carrying the scent of wildflowers and possibility. The sun set over the ranch as it had done countless times before, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. And in the gathering darkness, if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of laughter, the murmur of gentle voices, the sound of two souls finally, completely at peace. Their hands, once cracked and broken, were whole now, joined forever in the place beyond work and worry, where rest was not a luxury but a reward earned through a lifetime of love. They had found each other in the harshness of the frontier, two people who needed healing. And together, through patience and care and devotion that transcended death itself, they had taught everyone who came after them that the greatest strength was not in struggling alone, but in having the courage to accept help, to give love, to rest in the arms of someone who saw you and chose you and held you gently through all the storms. This was their legacy, written in the land and the family, and the enduring memory of a love that had conquered everything life threw at it. This was the story of Eleanor and Fletcher, the woman with cracked hands and the cowboy who told her to rest, and the beautiful life they built from that simple act of kindness that became a forever kind of love.